I worked for pretty much the last 50 years on the history of the Caliphate, the history of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the early Islamic Caliphate, and so on. But in the last 5 or 6 years, the whole question of Caliphate has come alive again, in a sense, as a as a subject for discussion and so on amongst Muslims. When I first started working on Caliphate and travelling in the Middle East and talking to people in the Middle East, Caliphate was about as relevant to people's everyday life as the Holy Roman Empire is to people in Europe today. It was something had existed a long time ago and had, in its way, been a glorious historical event, it had a long tradition, people wrote about it and blah blah blah, but it was nothing to do with anything that people were actually sort of thought was relevant to their general perceptions of life in the world they lived in and so on. It was a historical interest, but that was all. But in the second half of the 20th century, particularly the last quarter of the 20th century and into the 21st century, all that began to change. And I think it reflects a long-term change of priorities, if you like, or worldviews amongst people in the Middle East. That in the 20th century, the two, for particularly people in the Arab Middle East and in Iran, the two great ideas were firstly Arab or Persian nationalism. The first half of the century really is dominated by a nationalist discourse, that if there could be an Arab state or Arab states or whatever to resist the colonial powers and so on and so forth, then that was the way forward. And that's the thing that people discussed about as a way of looking at their future. In the second half, particularly after the coming to power of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt in 1952, to this nationalist discourse there was added a socialist discourse. That socialism and nationalism together were the ways in which people of the Middle East could achieve a political environment, a political system that was more responsive to their needs than the old system was, and above all, one that it would be an ideology which would repel and push back against Western imperialism and all that story. By the end of the 20th century, it had become apparent to lots and lots of people in the Middle East that these discourses, the discourse of nationalism and the discourse of socialism, were not working. They were not delivering to a generation of young people and the next one that followed that. They were not delivering the sort of society that was meaningful and helpful to them, and a society in which they felt they could express themselves and achieve what they wanted to achieve. And so it's into this ideological void, if you like, this ideological gap that renewed ideas and renewed discussion of the Caliphate emerge in the first couple of decades of the 21st century, from about 2001 onwards. But of course, this discourse, the discussion of Caliphate and Islamism more generally, but I'm going to concentrate on ideas of Caliphate in particular. The attraction idea of Caliphate is only worthwhile because it has an ancient, even if not very well remembered history, but an ancient history, and it speaks of a time when the Arab Muslim world was the most economically, culturally advanced, if you like. I'm not sure advanced is a very good word, but developed society in Western Eurasia, when Baghdad had a population of maybe 500,000 people, and at a time when London might have had 10,000, Paris might have had 10,000, and London probably had about 1,500. I mean, what we're talking about is a very, very different scale of urbanism, and with a very different scale of urbanism comes a very different scale of social complexity. and social interactions and so on. So I've been writing about Caliphate for a long time in various history books and so on, but with the coming of the ISIS Caliphate, I felt, and lots of people around in political south in Western Europe were saying, what is Caliphate? What do we understand by Caliphate? Where does this idea come from? So I wrote a little book that is published in a variety of things, but it's published in Pelican paperback there, which is simply called The Caliphate. It's a simple paperback book. You can buy it on Amazon for about €3 or €4. I think it's very commonly available. But what I was trying to do in this book was to look at old ideas of Caliphate, where ideas of Caliphate come from, and how they were relevant, how they interacted with the modern exposition of Caliphate, the modern interest in Caliphate. And I wanted to make the point, I think, above all, that Caliphate is, on the idea of Caliph and Caliphate, is a word that has many different meanings and developments through history. And one of the things that the ISIS Caliphate and its ideologues certainly tried to do was to take a very simplistic view, a very narrow view, if you like, of what was in fact a broad and extremely interesting and very diverse history. And to narrow it down to a certain sort of ideological, what should we say, straitjacket, narrow corridor, whatever terms we're going to use. So what does this term mean? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from an Arabic word called Khalifa, which means, well, what does it mean? And part of the ambiguity of the whole business about Caliphate through the centuries is that this word means two related but distinctly different things. The word Khalifa can mean either a deputy, that is somebody who does the job for somebody else when they're not there, for whatever reason. Or it can mean a successor, that is somebody who is succeeds somebody who's died or retired or whatever happened to them. So it is the idea of a deputy, at the same time the idea of a successor. And these words have interesting implications, which is something I'm going to develop in a minute or two. The word Khalifa appears in Quran, and there are two people who are described as Khalifa, and they're described as Khalifatullah, they're representatives of God. One of them is Adam, the first human, but also the first of the prophets. And the second one is, perhaps surprisingly, King David, King of Israel, who appears as Khalifa in the Quran. But the Quran also uses Khalifa in a broader sense, as the people are God's Khalifa on earth and so on. It's not, however, used in Quran, nor in the discourse of Prophet Muhammad as reflected in the hadith, the traditions of the Prophet. It's not reflected as a title of rulership or a title of leadership. Nonetheless, with the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and this is well known, Prophet Muhammad left no clear arrangements for his succession or anything like that. So in the aftermath of the Prophet's death, people began to use the term Khalifa to express or to describe the rulers of the new Muslim community. But and from a very early stage, different views of what a Khalifa was appear in the Muslim community. And this is reflected in that division, that schism between Sunnis and Shi'is. And it's against the background of this division that ideas about Khalifa are worked out. And something about the division between Sunnis and Shi'is is that the roots of this difference are apparent very early on after the death of Prophet Muhammad in the year 632. However, it's not until the year 900 or the early 10th century that the divisions become established in the sense that there's a Sunni sect, if you like, a Sunni branch of Islam, and a Shi'i branch of Islam. Before then, the boundaries are much vaguer, but the ideas are clearly with us. Ideas are clearly worked out. Basically, there are two strands of opinion about who should lead the Muslim community and who should provide the guidance for the Muslim community. So what sort of leadership and guidance were people looking for? Let's say, what was the job description, so to speak, of the leader of the Muslim community? And the first things were obviously things like organising the army, because it was a military operation at one level, and organising things like taxation and so on, as it were, the everyday administrative things, the protection of the Muslims against their enemies, the enabling of the Muslims to conduct the rites of prayer and the Hajj to the holy cities in peace and security, these sorts of things. But there is something else beyond that, as it were, secular administration that was required of leadership. And that was questions of religious guidance. Now, as is well known, the group of things that the group of ideas, or the ideas that become later referred to as Sharia, though it's not a word we find in the early texts to any great extent, is based on, firstly on Quran, and secondly on the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. The Sunnah being the example really in the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. And the Sunnah comes from two sources, particularly it comes from the Hadith, which are the recorded utterances of Prophet Muhammad as preserved by his companions and their successors and so on. And the other sort is the Seerah. And the Seerah is what he did. So the Seerah is, as it were, the biography of his deeds. Hadith is the collection of what he said. These two come together to be the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the point about this is that the Quran is not a law book. It does say, make legal statements about certain things, notably about inheritance and so on, but fundamentally it's not a law text. It's an inspirational text, it's a religious text, and it's an inspiring text, but it's not a law text. Nor does Hadith or does the Sunnah of the Prophet encompass all the things that Muslims, all the challenges that Muslims were faced with when Islam extended beyond the boundaries of the Arabian Peninsula into very different societies, into very different geographical backgrounds and so on. Now, so the question was really important, is who did you look to for guidance on religious questions? Now, these might be very important religious questions about matters of literally life and death. They might be quite minor things about religious ritual. Take us this very, very simple one that comes up in a number of different traditions. It's about ablution before prayer, washing before prayer. Very important. Feature, wasn't it? And if, the lawyers say, if a mouse comes along and falls into the water you're going to use for your ablution and drowns, what do you do? Do you pour out the water and get some new water, or do you take the dead mouse out and use the same water? Now, this may seem, in some ways, a sort of frivolous question, but actually it isn't. It's all about the nature of purification, how you should do it properly. Doing it properly is very important for the proper performance of salat, the proper performance of prayer, and so on. And the question about this, who do you look to make decisions about this? So that's what I'm talking about when I say that early Muslims were looking around for leadership. That's the sort, it's the everyday administration of a vast and expanding empire on the one hand, but it's also the question of religious authority on the other hand. And these are two slightly different functions. Now, in order to answer this question about who you look to, two different points of view emerge quite early on and are developed in the early centuries of Islam. And the first one is what we might call the Sunni point of view, the proto-Sunni point of view. And this develops with the idea, first and foremost, that the leader of the community should be basically, as it were, the chief executive of the Muslim community. It comes to be the person who organises the affairs of the Muslims in a way that is both just and enables Muslims to live their lives and perform their religion in the way that they want to do. But when it comes to working out the answers to the questions, as I say, the question of the mouse in the evolution, but just give one example, then you don't look to the ruler, you look to the religious, you look to the scholars, to the people who come to be known as ulama in the Muslim tradition. And that is the people who know the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. Because it's on the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad that you must base your knowledge and understanding of these things, and you must extrapolate and develop what you find in the Sunnah in order to answer contemporary questions. And when it comes to things like, is it legitimate for Muslims to smoke tobacco? Clearly the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad has no guidance about this because there was no tobacco in Prophet Muhammad's time. But what you do is extrapolate from what it says about various other noxious substances and alcohol and so on, and try to work out what Prophet Muhammad would have said about smoking tobacco, but he didn't, because for obvious reasons. So you look to the learned people. You don't look to the ruler, or the caliph in this sense. You look to the learned people to answer these sort of questions. And so in this view, and what we could call the Sunni point of view, at least in theory, you get a position where the ruler is, as I say, the chief executive. But the question of religious decision and religious guidance lies not with the ruler, but with the ulama. And this is the fundamental basis of Sunni ideas of what Caliphate is about. The Caliph is, I come back to this phrase, the chief executive of the Muslim community. But there comes, right from the very beginning, a very distinctly different point of view about how these things should be done. And the idea is that God chose Prophet Muhammad to be his spokesman on earth, to deliver his message to mankind. And the idea is developed from a very early time that, of course, with his death, the prophet, that God didn't just choose Prophet Muhammad, he chose a holy family. He chose a family who would be the recipients of divine wisdom. They couldn't be prophets because, as Muhammad was clear, he was the last of the prophets, the seal of the prophets. Nobody else would ever be a prophet like him. There had been, we're told, 144,000 prophets between the first of them, Adam, and the last of them, Muhammad. But that was the end of that. There were going to be no more. However, as I said, from a very early stage, lots of people felt that the family of the prophet, nonetheless had some divine sanction and divine inspiration, and were, in a sense, still had a spirit of prophethood, were still, they had, as it were, a direct line to God. Their status as the family of the prophet gave them a way of interpreting God's commands and so on. So rather than looking to the Hadith and the Sunnah, you look to the members of the family of the Prophet, who were sometimes called caliphs, sometimes called imams. But they were the people who would understand, and they were the people you looked to when you wanted to find out how to perform true religion and true Islam. And this is a point of view that comes to be known as Shiism, obviously, because after the Shia, meaning the party, the Shia of Ali, the Prophet had a number of sons, all of whom died in infancy or childhood. He had one daughter who survived to adulthood, Fatima, who married her cousin Ali, and it's the descendants of Ali and Fatima who therefore become the representatives of the Prophet Muhammad, and if you like, the representatives of God on earth. So right from the beginning, there are two very different ideas about rulership that emerge in the question of caliphate. For if you think about it, if the caliph is just the chief executive, then his authority is necessarily limited. And this goes on to the choice of who should be the rulers. And this is a very difficult thing. And the Sunni point of view comes to be that the rulers should be chosen, or, if you like, elected by men. However, this is not election in any sort of mass polling or election in the way that we come to us to think about it. Now, it very much, they had to be chosen by somebody. There could be 5 or 6 learned people, as in the election of the Caliph, or they could be just one elector, people decided in the end. But nonetheless, there was an idea that the ruler of the Caliph was chosen by men, and therefore his authority was necessarily limited. If, however, because men can make mistakes and choose the wrong person, if, on the other hand, the Caliph was chosen from the family of Prophet Muhammad, why then the family would be chosen by God, and the Caliph was therefore divinely appointed, and therefore had a much more absolute, a divine right, if you like, in the way that Western European monarchies conceived of this thing in the early modern period. It gave much more absolute authority to the or it gave a quasi-divine authority to the ruler. And so we get very different views right from the very beginning of who should be a caliph and how should they be chosen. And I want to emphasize this because it just points out that the fact that the idea of caliphate has many different variations, many different ideas. People think about it in different ways in different communities. And the problems, or the things don't end there. Clearly, there are who should choose the caliph. In the Sunni tradition, there has to be a election, but then the Sunni tradition adds on to that the idea of designation. Nas is the Arabic word for this, that the previous ruler can designate a new ruler. And this opens the door, so to speak, gives the theoretical justification for hereditary succession. Because fathers designate sons. Sometimes they just designate one son, sometimes they designate more than one son, and civil war and dispute normally results from this. But the idea of election is not stress-free. It doesn't solve the problems. Who are the electors? How many electors should there be? Etc., etc. Equally, the idea of hereditary succession doesn't solve all the problems of choosing a new ruler. And this works in a variety of ways, and it results in the breaking up of the Shia into a number of different groups. Take what happens with the death of one of the great early Shia Imams, the 6th Imam Jafar Sadiq, in the 760s, in the early Abbasid period that is. And here was a question, because his eldest son, it appears, who was called Ismail, his eldest son Ismail died before his father. Now, this is a problem if you believe that God has designated the eldest son of the eldest son. What's gone wrong? Well, not what's gone wrong. How are we to interpret divine will in these circumstances? Should we say that the divine will was that Ismail died early, and that for whatever reason, and that the succession passed to his children? Or should we infer that for some reason God thought that Ismail was unsuitable, and therefore the succession had passed to his next brother, who was Muhammad, and that he was rightful imam, and that Ismail's early death had been God's way of showing that he was not an appropriate leader of the Muslim community? And this may seem a really obscure thing that happened in the 760s, who cares? But right down to the present day, the Ismailis, that's those who believe that the children of Ismail that the true inheritance of Prophet Muhammad, form a distinctive, vibrant, very interesting part of the wider Muslim Ummah. What happens in these ancient succession questions has determined the history of Islam in many ways right down to the present day. And then, in the Shia point of view, from the Shia point of view, you get the disappearance of the imams. There are 12 imams, the last of whom is a very shadowy figure who seems to disappear in Samarra in Iraq in the 850s. And for the Imami Shi'is, that's say the Shias of Iraq and Iran, then the question is, what does this mean? What do we do about it? And in this way, you get round the problem of succession to the Prophet Muhammad, and chooses the successor of Prophet Muhammad by developing the idea of the hidden imam. Now, the hidden imam is the last of the imams who has never died. Certain figures in Western European history, if you like, King Arthur in England, Frederick Barbarossa in Germany, and so on, they're still alive somewhere, and at some crucial point they will come and rescue the nation from all sorts of disasters. But the Imam is in the world. There could be no true Islam without the Imam, but however, we don't know where he is, nobody's ever spoken to him, he never communicates. And in these circumstances, you have to find people who can interpret what the hidden Imam would have said if we knew what he said, which we don't, because he doesn't grant us, and so on. And this is where the hidden Imam, this is where the figures who have been known since the 19th century as Ayatollahs in Iraqi and Iranian Shiism come in. They are the signs of God. They are the people who understand what the Imam would be deciding if we knew what he would be deciding. So we can extrapolate from their learning, from their knowledge of traditions and so on, what the Imam would be saying. Now, this is actually a very important thing in terms of modern political debate for this reason. Those who, like the followers of the followers of the ISIS Caliphate, believe that the Caliphate should be the rulers of, or the leader of all Muslims. From this very Sunni point of view here. But for the Shia, this is impossible. Because there is a Caliph, or more normally called Imam, but it's the same thing. There is a Caliph in the world, but we just don't know who he is. And this means that there is no space in Shia Islam for a revived Caliphate. It's a fundamental ideological block that various people in the Shia world might feel sympathetic to the idea of a revived Muslim state and so on, but there is no space for a revived Caliphate in Shia Islam. And this means that any idea of a revived Caliphate is bound to be divisive. And there's sort of no getting away from this fundamental distinction. And so we see again how ideological and political discussions that happen in the early Middle Ages are absolutely vital. Understanding is absolutely vital to understanding what Caliphate is and could be in the modern era. And of course, Caliphate and caliphs had their political ups and downs. We could easily point to the time of the Umayyad caliphs and above all the Abbasid caliphs, and here your little factories will point out the main dates and so on. And we can point out to the times when caliphs were supreme. They're not in any sense absolute rulers of the Muslim community, a community that was multicultural, in important ways multicultural, and basically religiously broadly tolerant. Caliphs did not affect to tell people what sort of religious belief they ought to have, as long as they paid their taxes, very important, and kept the peace, equally important. People could more or less do what they believed, what they liked. Of course, the caliph was, in a sense, the leader of the Muslim community. But in the 10th century, all this began to fall apart for reasons that are quite complicated. Going in a short presentation like this, the caliphs lost their power. The caliphate began to fall apart. There were two main reasons for this. One of them was the economic collapse of Iraq, which is the economic and ecological catastrophe of Iraqi agriculture in the 10th century, widely documented both in texts and in archaeological evidence, which fundamentally transformed the political economy of the Middle East, because Iraq had previously been the richest, most populous, by a long way, the richest and most populous part of the Arab Muslim world. From then on, the centres of political geography go to Egypt, which takes over in around the year 1000. Egypt has replaced Iraq, both the economic and the ideological, as it were, leadership of the Sunni Muslim world, or to towns in Iran and other places, and even to Cordoba in Spain and so on. So the caliphate collapses because the economy that supports it collapses. And it collapses for a more fundamental reason, which I think is, again, any proponents of revived caliphate again have to tackle, is that the breakup of the caliphate does not mean that there was a sort of rebellion against Islam or anything like that. The people who succeeded the caliphate were, politically, were almost without exception Muslims. And anybody who tried to set up an anti-Muslim movement and so on, it didn't work. And disasters happened to them and so on. But what you get is local Muslim elites who are truly Muslim in, say, Egypt or in Bukhara and Samarkand, for that matter. In all the towns you get local Muslim elites who are Muslims but have no business with the caliphate at all. They never go to Baghdad, they've never seen the caliph. He may have a certain sort of, a certain sort of reputation or something like that. But this, you get specifically an Egyptian Islamic culture, North African Islamic culture, which the people who belong to this culture recognize that they are part of a Muslim, what I call a Muslim commonwealth. They recognize a common language of religion in Arabic. They recognize a common sense of values and so on, and the adherence to Quran and so on and so on. But what they don't do is recognize any common sovereignty. And in a way, the breakup of the caliphate was a result of the success of Islam. The success of Islam in the conversion of the bulk of the population of what we now think of the Islamic world to the new religion. It's because we get these vibrant local Muslim communities that the caliphate becomes irrelevant to their needs, to their religious aspirations, the way they organise their everyday lives. And they want to be ruled by local rulers. They want to be ruled by people who answer to their needs rather than somebody who has lives in a big palace in Baghdad and never goes out, never sees anybody. And this again is going to make any ideas of a revived caliphate, this simple, this fact, extremely, well, I think, actually probable and by and large impossible. After the 12th century, and particularly after the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols in 1258, and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate in Iraq, the idea of caliphate floats around, but it's almost never used. The Mamluk rulers of Egypt from 1260 to 1517, the greatest Muslim power, at least in the Western Islamic world, in the late Middle Ages. The rulers called sultans. They keep a member of the Abbasid family as a sort of puppet caliph and so on, but it's the sultan. The word means power. The word sultan is about power, is about effective military force, and so on. The Mamluk sultans exercise power in that name. The Ottomans use the title of sultan, though they do claim to be caliphs of Islam. Particularly curiously enough, the Ottomans looked to the title of caliph in the late 19th century, and this is quite an interesting phenomenon. In the time when the Ottoman Sultanate was supremely powerful, when they effectively ruled the whole of the south and eastern Mediterranean, this enormous empire and so on, they never used the title caliph really at all. They were the sultan. In the late 19th century, however, when the Ottomans felt increasingly threatened by encroaching Western imperialism and other disparate movements and so on, they start once again to look back to the idea of the Ottoman Sultan as caliph. And particularly the last of the long-lived Ottoman sultans, Abdul Hamid II, I'm sorry, his name should be on your on your fact sheet there, I'm sorry about that. Abdul Hamid II, who was eventually deposed in 1909, he begins to revive the idea of the Sultan as caliph as a way of trying to provide a leadership for the Muslim world against the encroachments of Western imperialism, of attracting the leadership of Muslims in areas like Egypt, which had become independent of the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century, and even in faraway areas like India, where the Ottomans had never ruled at all. Nonetheless, the idea of caliphate was thought to have some traction, some viability as a way of attracting support. And in fact, there was a time, the last of the Ottoman sultans was deposed in 1922. That was the end of the Ottoman Sultanate. But for 2 years, a member of the Ottoman family had the title of caliph from 1922 to 1924. And so there was, as it were, arguably, once again, a caliph who led the Sunni community. But in 1924, the last of the Ottoman caliphs disappeared, was removed. And there was quite a lot of discussion about the who should there be a new caliph? People looked to the king of Egypt, sometimes the emir of Mecca, and thought maybe these people would do, but nobody really attracted very much support. And the debate died. As I said, the debate moves on to nationalism and then on to socialism. Caliphism is just nowhere on the political radar of people in the Middle East in the mid-20th century. But as I said, when these the 20th century ideological models fail, and particularly as a result of the 67 war, but much more wider social discontents and so on in the Middle East, people start looking back through their history. And here again, two different strands emerge in the development of idea. And one of them, and I see it in your program, you're going to have a whole lecture on the Muslim Brotherhood, on the Ikhwan and so on, so that will be done. But the point of view of most mainstream Islamic reform movements has been that the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, really leading the discussion in this aspect, is that what we need is a moral reform of society. We can only get a proper Muslim society if people are pious, people are honest, rich people are generous to the poor, and we follow the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad and the Sharia. Therefore, a moral reform. Maybe once we've got this, everybody is being converted to this new way of thinking about things, then maybe the Caliphate has a place in the leadership of a united Muslim state. But it's the moral reform that needs to come first. But from the 1950s onwards, small groups of people began to argue that this was the wrong way around. That what you needed to do was to re-establish a caliphate, and the caliphate would generate, a powerful caliph would generate and lead the moral reform of the Muslim community. And that we should look back, and this puts it right back to looking not to Prophet Muhammad so much, but to the history of the Caliphate, to try to recover the history of the Caliphate when, as I said, the Muslim community seems to be so dynamic and so powerful. So people start to argue that a revived Caliphate should be not the last stage of the revival of the Muslim community, but should actually be the first stage, or at least very early in the stage. And the people who, it's mostly this idea is generated by Hizb ut-Tahrir and by the leadership of Taqiyuddin, sorry, there's a mistake there, Taqiyuddin Nafani, sorry, from 1952 onwards. But these ideas were tossing around in the late 20th century, but it's not until the 21st century that somebody tries to take it upon themselves to make these ideas a reality. And this is where we come to the ISIS Caliphate. The ISIS Caliphate, there was a lot of debate about whether it was a real caliphate or not, and so on. But the trouble is, with looking back through Islamic discussions about caliphate, you can find every different sort of caliphate in Islamic history that you want to. It's difficult. There is no one law, there's no one blueprint. As I've said before, there are sorts of ideas about who should be the caliph and who shouldn't be. You can't say that it was an illegitimate caliphate, because there is no agreed law about what a legitimate caliphate is. The leader of it, the caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, claimed to be a descendant of the Prophet's tribe Quraysh, which he may well have been. I mean, the descendants of the Prophet's tribe Quraysh are innumerable nowadays. From the very beginning, the ISIS Caliphate developed itself as a historical project. In terms of justifying what was going on, there's a constant referring backwards to the examples of early Islamic history. The ideology was firmly based on the idea that we are reviving the practices of the great early Muslims. And the ISIS Caliphate was politically, I think, atrocious in all sorts of ways, and the extraordinary cruelty and violence with which this was done has appalled people. It's nonetheless also an ideological project. And if we don't understand this, then we're not going to understand why it has appealed to Muslims across the spectrum in various ways. It's only if we listen to the ideology that we can see how this could have the effect that it always had. And the use of history is very partial and selective. And the ISIS argument has been that caliphs were always strong, stern, virtuous people, and they put their enemies to death, and a certain model of caliphate. But the trouble with this, in a sense, is there isn't another model that is widely understood or accepted. When it came to Caliphate, the ideologues of ISIS essentially took over the ideology of Caliphate, because there was no ideological counterpoint to it. There weren't people wading in and saying, actually, you misunderstood, and your history is not very good, and so on and so forth. And I think this is one of the ways in which, if we're going to critique and oppose, in fact, the ISIS ideology, it has to be done on ideological basis, as well as on a, bombing the hell out of them basis. Because unless you construct an ideological pushback against this idea of Caliphate, then this idea of Caliphate will still hold the field, and it will still have a romantic and political attraction for certain sections of the Muslim community, and certain non-Muslims who convert to Islam as well. I mean, let's have a look at, I want to finish up this with just show you how this attachment to an ancient tradition was very much part of the ISIS image. When the ISIS Caliphate appeared, they published an online magazine which was called Darbik, The Return of the Khilafah. This is the first issue. The date is 1435, Ramadan. Darbik is online. You can get it, and you can read it all if you've got the strength and energy. Or I don't know, it's just not published anymore now. But the idea of the revival of the Caliphate, the date, as I say, is Ramadan 1435. Darbik never used Common Era dates. All was Hijri dates, and that's part of it. And the return of the Khilafah was where it begins. And the, go to the lights above the desk out of it, because it's quite difficult to see something. Right, the Darbik was extraordinarily skillfully produced, very high editorial values in terms of illustrations. Thanks so much. The referred Darbik itself is interesting because it's a reference to ancient Muslim prophecies that we find from the Umayyad period, that the great conflict between the Muslims and their enemies would take place at a place called Darbik, which is a known place in northern Syria. I mean, it's a tiny village. I'm not even sure it exists as a village, but it's a known place in northern Syria. But this is important because Darbik was using an obscure early Islamic prophecy to identify itself. And this was part of the whole discourse of these people, that we know more about early Islamic history than you do. We understand why Darbik is important. You've never heard of it. And if you want to find out what it is, then you have to ask us. And the whole of Darbik and the politicalism is full of obscure illusions. It takes a certain sort of cultural high ground to say, we know and you don't, all these things about the early Islamic world. And it uses a sort of code word to describe their enemies. Some of them quite obviously people are called Tolgia, and they're sort of representative of pharaohs and so on and so forth, all taken from early Islamic political discourse in Quran. But there's one that I particularly want to, and that is that the Saudis, of course, who are bitter, who the ISIS people really sort of hate and despise and so on, are described as Ahl Salul, S-A-L-U-L. And I spent a long time trying to work out what this means, because it's not obvious, clearly. Ahl Salul, family Salul, who is Salul, or what's this all about? Until I realised, not quite right, the Prophet Muhammad had a great enemy in Medina in his lifetime, who was called Abdullah ibn Ubay. And Abdullah ibn Ubay was the chief of the hypocrites who opposed Prophet Muhammad in his lifetime. Okay? Everyone knows Abdullah ibn Ubay. It's famous. Not everyone knows that he was Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, because he's never referred to by the three names, or very, very rarely. So what David was saying was, firstly, that the Saudis were just like the hypocrite Abdullah ibn Ubay. But secondly, that they know that his grandfather, Abdullah ibn Ubay's grandfather, was called Salul, and therefore they have the inside knowledge, therefore that is the term they're going to use. And so if you want to understand what this whole discussion is about, you have to ask them, and some learned person will explain that this is the origin of it. You see, it's about not just making the point against the Saudis, but controlling the system of knowledge, so that you can only really understand it if you're a learned insider, or if you ask the Darwic intellectuals to explain this. And so, and let's have a look at some more Darwic here. They always refer to provinces of the Middle East, not by their modern geographical names, but the old provinces which they were. These existed. The black banners relate directly to the Abbasids, the Abbasid Caliphate, with Black Banner. And this is the only known photograph, as far as I know, of Abu Bakr Baghdadi preaching in the now destroyed Great Mosque in Mosul. The pledging of allegiance to the new state is the laying on of hands and the stroking of hands, what's known in early Arabic as the bay'ah. The bay'ah is the mechanism for swearing allegiance to new rulers. Here is the bay'ah. The bay'ah is an old revision of what people imagine to be an old, the old Muslim way of pledging allegiance, revived by the ideologues of the ISIS Caliphate. Just again, you're constantly looking back into the past and picking things out to make the points. And a lot of it is just the image of battles and so on is, I mean, it's so strange. I mean, it's a very romanticised view here. The black horses, the black banners, the black robes. This is the sort of thing that people have fed as an idea of what ISIS looks like. If you actually look at television fields from the battlefields, of course, they're all in jeans and, you know, and the whole thing is sort of is murky and horrible beyond belief. But this is the image that's being passed, you know, the curved scimitars, the horses, etc. It's a religion of the sword. And this is translated into more obvious, more sort of up-to-date versions of that. An interesting project was to revive early Islamic coinage. Again, looking back into the past and grounding the symbols of it. There were going to be gold dinars, silver dirhams, middle rank, and copper fulus, small change, and so on. The pure gold dinars there at the top. The actual iconography of it is curiously not traditional. The coins are quite puzzling. I mean, the top right there, we look at the gold dinar and the silver dirham underneath it on the right-hand side. Those relate to the early Muslim tradition of epigraphic coinage, no images. But the other things, the wheat, the map of the world, on the 5 dirham is a conceptualized version of the Mosque of Damascus. The 10 has the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Are curiously not related to this. I'm not quite sure why. And I've never seen any of these coins. I don't know how many were ever actually minted, but it was certainly an attempt to get away not just from credit cards, but also from dollars and from paper money as well. This was going to be a new, sound, gold and silver coinage, just as had existed in the great days of the early caliphs. And these sort of familiar images, the glamorized image here. I'm quite fascinated by these images. I have no idea where they come from. They're obviously supposed to be ISIS fighters, but I suspect that they come from a model agency in Karachi or something like that. I mean, they're so unlike any of the images that we've actually seen from a context of the period of ISIS and birth. And I think I pass on these things, I don't want to linger on them, but this sums up the appeal of this sort of, the romantic appeal, the appeal to the past. It's a sexy appeal. There's a strong, in a lot of this, and I could, I'm not going to deal with all this today, but in a lot of this ISIS propaganda, there are strong homoerotic elements, I think, particularly with the cultivation of small boys and the patronising of small boys and so on, that I think a later generation may feel strong enough to go and investigate, but I'm not going to do that right now. Maybe relieved to hear. But what I want to do is, what I've been trying to do in this is to point out how the ideals of Caliphate, now this is Caliphate, we go right back to the early Middle Ages, have a potency and have, in certain circumstances, an inspirational quality that, if we don't understand it, then we're or not aware of it, we don't have to sympathise with it. If we're not going to understand it, why then we're not going to be able really to work out what's going on and what persuades people, has persuaded people, and I think will persuade people still in different areas to go on with this. And secondly, if we're going to push back against this ideology, then we have to do it in terms of pushing back against a view of Islamic history, pushing back against this monolithic, very narrow view of what Caliphate is, reasserting the paramountcy of a more pluralist Caliphate, which is certainly typical of the Umayyad and earlier Abbasid period, because otherwise we're not really going to, as it were, have any traction with these people at all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm quite happy to answer questions.